equipping you to navigate your grief journey after child and sibling loss. This is the Hope After Child and Sibling Loss podcast. On each episode, we explore the many challenges of grief as guests share their stories of loss. It's also a place where you'll hear about God showing up in our darkest moments and restoring meaning, purpose, and hope to shattered lives. I'm Greg Bufkin, your host and one of the co-founders of the Empty Chair Endeavor. To learn more about us, please visit our website at www.emptychairendeavor.com. Well, hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Greg Bufkin, your host, and today you'll be listening to a conversation I recently had with Ann Starke as she shares the story of losing her precious 16-year-old son, David, to suicide in September of 2000. Suicide rates as of 2025 in the U.S. have risen between 37 and 48% since the year 2000 in the general population. But it's now the second leading cause of death in youth and young adults aged 20 to 34. The impact of suicide on parents and families is both devastating and far-reaching. So I hope you'll listen as Ann shares about the impact of suicide in her life and how Jesus began healing and restoring her brokenness to a life today that's filled with hope and purpose. And now, here's my conversation with Ann. Well, Ann, welcome to our podcast. It is so good to have you with us today. I've really been looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Greg. I'm happy to be here today.
Well, the privilege is all mine. And before we dive into your story, Ann, why don't you take a minute or two and just give us a little bit of personal information about you or your family, your work, whatever it is you'd like to share, and then we'll just dive in.
Okay. Well, I'm a wife, and I'm a mother, and I'm a grandmother. My husband and I will be married 49 years this March.
Congratulations.
We have 2 children, and like anyone who's lost a child, the dreaded question is, how many children do you have? And it took me many years to come up with what I was going to say in that situation. And I came to the conclusion that I would tell people that we have a daughter who lives in Massachusetts and we have a son who lives in heaven.
Yeah.
And you kind of have to be prepared for the fallout when you tell them that you've lost a child, because then the next thing is, well, how old was he and how did he die? So I'm very comfortable now sharing my story. It's a hard story. And I tell people right up front, I'll say, I have a hard story, because I know that a lot of people, especially when I say how David died, which was by suicide, it kind of catches them off guard, and then they're at a loss for words.
Yeah.
It's just something that I've become comfortable with over the years because I've done a little bit of suicide prevention. And I want to share my story because my story is a story of hope.
Absolutely.
Another part of me, a big part of me, is that I've been a nurse for over 50 years. When I was 21 years old, I was working at the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, and I saw a lot of children lose their lives. And I sort of had this bargaining thing going on with God that, hey, when I have children, just so you know, that is something that is more than I could bear. And I know people talk about, oh, God will never give us more than we can bear. And so I had to wrestle with God for many years, and I had to wrestle with that statement. But what I've come to realize is that God did not give me more than I could bear, but he gave me as much as I could bear. And the hardest thing about being a nurse, and David took his life at home. My husband and I were both there. We both found him. And as a medical person, there was nothing that I could do to save him. And so that was a big part of my trauma, not just finding him, but also not being able to do anything to help him.
Yeah. I can't imagine finding your child and then those feelings of helplessness
Mhm.
not only as a parent, but yours was even magnified more because of your professional training as a nurse and to be able to do nothing. I think that's one of the hardest things about losing a child to suicide is it leaves you with so many questions. What could I have done? What should I have seen? What should we have recognized? And that list just goes on and on and then the guilt comes in because we imagine that if we had only seen this or if we were only aware of this, maybe we could have stopped it. And we come to realize that we don't have the control that we used to think that we did. I remember that was one of the things that really hit me hard was that, I almost lived this formulaic approach to my relationship with the Lord. If I do this, this will be the result. If I don't do that, the Lord will be more pleased with me and, that sort of thing. And what I discovered is that control that I thought I had was just an illusion.
Mhm.
And, it's losing a child to suicide is incredibly messy and incredibly traumatic, as you said a moment
Mhm.
ago. So tell us a little bit about David. As his mom, what would you want our listeners to know about David?
Well, David was a great kid, and he was tall and he was handsome, and he liked to brag about the fact that he had a six pack. You know what a six pack is?
I do.
When you have really good abs.
I don't have one, but I know what it is.
And he was loved by everyone. He had so many friends, and he was loved by his teachers. And it just came as such a shock to everyone when he did pass away because they just couldn't believe that it was David Stark. Are you sure it was David Stark? But when David was about 12, his sister went off to college, and they were 6 years apart, but they were very close. And she was actually like a second mother to him. And when she went away to school, he grieved her. He really grieved her, and he was sad. David was always a happy-go-lucky, easygoing, very tender heart, but I just saw this sadness in him. But it didn't worry me too much. I mean, those years are hard years. And yet when he turned 14, he was working at a golf course. He was a golfer from the time he was 6 years old, and they put a golf club in his hands. He just loved it. He would eat and breathe golf. He was good at all sports, but he preferred golf over everything.
Well,
And he would be out on the golf course all day long. And when he was working at the golf course, when he would get out of work, he'd go out on the course and he would hit balls, and I would go pick him up at sundown. And I noticed that by the time he would turn 15, he wasn't himself. And I noticed that he wanted me to come pick him up right after work. He didn't want to go out on the golf course. And at first I thought it was more like a seasonal affect disorder,
right.
because he would start off school in September, and he would do really well, and he would be involved in activities, and by January, February, he would like take a nosedive. And so again, I didn't think much of it, but I read a book called Real Boys by William Pollock,
Hmm.
and there's a chapter in there on depression.
Okay.
And he was about 15 at the time, and I read this chapter, and I could just check off the list of all these things. When I said to my husband, I'm like, David's depressed. And of course, it's one of those things that people don't understand about depression, because people would say, well, what does he have to be depressed about? He,
Yeah.
everybody loves him. He's got friends, and he's a great guy. And he didn't want to feel that way. He,
Of
he
course
really
not.
struggled with it, because I would say to him, David, what's wrong? And he'd say, I don't know, Mom. I just don't know. And then the March that he turned 16, one of his friends in the youth group shot himself.
Oh gosh.
And when Tommy died, I went into, mama bear mode.
Of course you did.
And I was like, I could see that David was really struggling. He was pulling away from things, away from some of his friends, and he just wasn't the happy-go-lucky, funny kid that we all knew.
Right.
So I took him to an adolescent psychiatrist, in Hartford, Connecticut. And he was so impressed with David that he agreed to counsel David himself.
Wow.
And at the same time, we put him on medication. And the psychiatrist was never worried about David, taking his life, even after Tommy died. And as a church, our church kind of went into a little bit of panic mode also we had a lot of meetings as parents and getting together and talking about suicide.
Right.
And even David's sister said to him one time, David, suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem.
Mm.
And so, but he told his dad and I that's something he would never do. But I think that's the thing about depression is that when you're in that dark place, and I got to that place myself after David died.
Yeah.
Even though I had promised my family, I would never take my life. I was in such a dark place that I really didn't know what I would do, although I didn't have a plan. And I think after Tommy died, one of the questions that David had for his dad was, well, Dad, where do you think he put the gun? And of course, the boys all want to know that kind of stuff. They want to know what kind of gun it was and where did he put it? Because Tommy did not die right away. They were able to procure all his organs. And at Tommy's service, his father got up and eulogized his son and praised him for all the lives that he saved with his eyes and his heart and his liver and this, that, and the other thing. And
Wow.
there's my son sitting in the church who's depressed, who's hearing all the lives that Tommy saved by dying. And, David just being 16, he just didn't realize the ramifications of, using a shotgun versus a pistol. And
Mm.
there was nothing we could do.
And I am so sorry. It's really interesting as I've listened to you share this. Our lives ran such a parallel with what you described about at different ages, what you began to see in David. So very similar to our son Ryan. And I don't think anybody, as you said a moment ago, very few people, I would say, really realize that depression, clinical depression, goes far above and beyond the emotional state. It affects us mentally, it affects us physically, it affects us spiritually, and it's not just about feeling better. There are chemical imbalances that occur in our brains. And, when you're 16 years old, or even 26 in Ryan's case, I think especially with young men, like when you ask him what was wrong and he said, I don't know. I think young men have a very hard time putting those thoughts and feelings into words and expressing it that they think it is adequate in any way, shape, or form. And a lot of times, unfortunately, there are things like that we attribute to being a teenager and to just the stuff that they're dealing with in the culture and in school, and the list goes on and on. So you guys really had no warning, very, very much like us. It just, you wake up one morning and your child is here, and you wake up the next morning and your child's no longer here. And you never had a chance to say goodbye. You never had a chance to hold their hand, or, you know what I mean? The impact is something you can't even begin to imagine unless you've lived it. And we wouldn't want anybody else to be able to say that they understand, because that means they had to have lived it.
Right, right.
So what I would like to spend a minute talking about too, Anne, is that, when, and you were describing this a moment ago, sometimes after we lose a child, the pain is so intense and the trauma is so deep that sometimes we don't even know if we want to survive. And sometimes parents consider taking their own lives. Thankfully, most don't. But as you said, it's such a dark place to find yourself in that sometimes it just feels like, okay, I just want to go and join my child in heaven. you know? And that would be the quickest way to do it. But you're not thinking about like you said with David and like with Ryan, they didn't think about the consequences and the impact or fallout on other people's lives. So I'm thankful that the Lord met you in that dark place and helped you to be able to gain perspective, and he brought you out of that dark place into a better place.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I didn't want to survive. First of
Yeah,
all, I didn't know how I was going to survive. And my faith was shattered. My heart was shattered.
of course.
And my grief was so consuming. It consumed me. And so David died it was the first day of school, which was not a coincidence because there were things going on at school that we didn't know about until after we had an idea that he and his friends were being bullied, but a
Okay.
lot of it didn't come to light until after he died. But my daughter had graduated from college. Thank the Lord, because I don't think she would have graduated had she not already graduated. And she's always been a really independent person. And I thought, she's going to be okay. And my husband, I don't care about him. I just want to be with David. And what I didn't realize at the time was how hurtful that was to them, especially to my daughter, because she would say, well, what about me, Mom? I'm still here. I still have my life, but I couldn't get past this grief that was so heavy. And I spiraled quickly into a depression. David died in September. By mid-November, I was in a very dark place, and my husband called home one day to check on me, and he didn't like the way I sounded, so he called the police, and they took
Gosh.
me away. I said, "Are
No,
you serious? You're going to take me away?" And I fought it at first, and then I just went into a fetal position. Don't forget, I'm not eating, I'm not sleeping, I'm crying all the time. And
very common.
yeah, and I remember my therapist did say to me though, she said, "And if you take your life, your your daughter will never survive."
Yeah.
And so that was always in the back of my mind because I didn't think I would be able to do that. But they took me away. By the time my husband got to the hospital, I was in a fetal position, and he thought they had drugged me. But they just kept coming in wanting me to take my clothes off, and I wouldn't. They'd come in, and I didn't know, are you the cleaning lady or are you the nurse or are you the doctor? And I found myself getting angrier and angrier, which worked in my favor because sometimes that anger piece really helps us to do what we need to do.
Yeah.
And for me, it meant getting on medication, which I resisted at first because David was on an antidepressant, and it did seem to be helping him. But after he died, it was like all his friends were on medication all of a sudden. But I knew that I had to do something because I couldn't keep on living like I was living. So we talk about tear soup and all the things that go into healthy grieving. And in my soup, it was Prozac because that was a great drug for me, and it really helped me to be in a better place for God to meet me where I was at.
Yeah. I'm glad you shared that, Anne, because, when I think back to early part of our conversation, you are a medical professional and I was a pharmaceutical rep. And like you, I eventually was diagnosed with clinical depression a few months after we lost Ryan. It's interesting that you can be in that world every day in the medical profession. You know all the symptoms, you know the treatments, and you know that most often physicians prescribe antidepressants for somebody who is battling clinical depression. Because if you don't, then the results can be not very good, whether it's suicide or just going into a deep spiral. But I'm glad that you had somebody in your life, like your husband, who recognized that something wasn't right. Even though you initially resisted, you finally did cooperate and allowed the doctor to prescribe Prozac. Interestingly enough, I take Prozac as well, and it does help. And I want people to understand who are listening that it doesn't fix us. The antidepressant's not designed to fix us. It doesn't take away the grief or the pain. It's just designed to basically give us a leg up, to help bring those chemicals back into balance so that we can then cope normally, so that
Mhm.
we can walk through it normally. And then we're able to even reach out to God in prayer, because sometimes when you're so depressed, you don't even think about doing that.
Right. Especially when you're angry with God.
Yeah, yeah, and that's not uncommon. And if you're listening today and you find yourself angry with God because, because you lost your child, He's a good father, and he understands our emotions. He's fine with you expressing that. He loves it when we come to him and express that instead of keeping it inside, because let's face it, he already knows what we're thinking to begin with. So it's not like we're keeping it from him, but we're just not dealing with it, is basically what it amounts to. And that
And you
never
know what I
works.
did?
What
You
you
know
did?
what I did? I dared God to heal me.
Did you?
I'm like, there is no way that you can heal me of this deep loss.
Aw,
And, I remember a friend said to me, because I didn't leave the church, but I couldn't go to church.
I get
And a
it.
friend of mine said, that's your Goliath, Annie. And I was like, well, it may be, but I go to church and I see intact families and I see all of David's friends. My kids both grew up in that church, and it was just too hard. And it was hard enough just to get up every day and get dressed. My
Oh, yeah.
friends was, when was the last time you took a shower, Annie? And so I stopped doing what was really hard. And a friend of mine said, well, what brought you back to God? Because I was gone and I didn't want anything to do with the God thing. If it was the God thing, not doing it. And I had a friend who lost her son 3 years after I lost David, and we had known each other for many years. So I reached out to her when her son died, and she was going to a conference in California for mothers who had lost children. And it's an umbrella ministry conference. And I said, is it the God thing? And she said, well, yeah. I said, well, then I'm not going. And so I didn't for 2 years. She asked me. And then the third year, right around that time, David had been gone about 5 or 6 years. My husband said to me one day, he says, you know what, honey? I think you're becoming bitter. And I said, what? Me? Bitter? I don't want to be bitter. My mom was bitter and I don't want to be bitter. And so when she asked me the third year, I said, all right, I'll go to California, but I'm not singing any songs and I'm not going to any of those God things. But I'll go because you know what? There's going to be 100 moms there. And maybe I need to listen to them because they know. They know. I don't want to listen to the church ladies because, they're telling me, you need to go to church, Annie. And I'm like, I have a hard enough time getting out of bed every day, let alone going to church.
Right.
Seeing people I don't want to see, because that's another thing with suicide. People avoid you like the plague. You
Yeah,
know,
we noticed.
the grocery store, they see you and they go in the next aisle.
Yeah.
It's a real thing.
That was one of the I'm sorry, I was just gonna say that was one of the hardest things for Kathy, my wife, to do for a couple of years after we lost Ryan, was to go in the grocery store because of the same reason you just said.
Well, that and the fact that you go down the aisle that has all of David's favorite foods. I couldn't go down the cookie aisle for years. And I would go to a grocery store 2 towns over, so I didn't have to, see anybody. It's funny because it's been 25 years and I still have trouble going to this one store in the little town where we lived.
Yeah, people don't realize how long lasting that impact can be.
Yes.
25 years later, that's what some people don't understand, is that you don't just quit grieving one day. You're not
Mm-mm.
suddenly well one day and there's no more grief or
Mhm.
pain.
Yeah.
It's a lifelong journey that we have to learn how to navigate.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, so I went to California, and when I left California, I had hope in my heart for the first time in 6 years.
Wow.
And because I had to listen to what these women had to say. And I still didn't want to do the God thing, but at the same time, God gave me a vision as we were
Did
packing
he?
up. I was packing my suitcase, and I just heard, in my heart, I heard, God said to me, okay, now I want you to go back to Connecticut, and I want you to take this hope back to Connecticut. And I want you to start this group, and I want you to call it Hearts of Hope. And I want you to make a heart, and it's going to have a hole in the middle, because that's the reunion heart, that someday that hole will be filled. So I said to my friend who was with me, who got me to go, I said, hey, we got to go back to Connecticut and do this. And she said, do what, Annie? And I said, we got to bring hope back to Connecticut.
Oh, I
And
love it.
I mean, we started this support group, and God just, He blessed us financially. I mean, money just came out of the woodwork, and we started delivering, we called them baskets of hope to moms who had lost children. And, my friend, of course, she did the God thing from the beginning. She turned to God instead of turning away from God like I did. And so we kind of had to meet in the middle to facilitate this group together. And there were times where I would just say, nope. I said, you know what? We're not putting that book in the basket, because it's a God book. And if I'd gotten a basket with that kind of a book, I would have thrown it out. And so, you know, it's interesting how the years went by, because we did the ministry for about 13 years. God just brought me back. I think of Hagar when she ran away into the desert, and God went after her. And that was what a friend of mine said, well, what brought you back to God? And I said, he did. I didn't, she said, well, what did you do? I said, I didn't do anything. But he came and he got me and he brought me back. And, once my heart was softened, I was able to look at the ways that God had reached into my grief to heal me. But I couldn't see that when I was so angry with him,
Yeah.
and the
It
bitterness was sitting in.
it clouds everything. And don't you love how God loves us? He didn't get angry with you. He didn't punish you for getting angry with him. He gave you time and space, and he was patient and kind. And then he arranges your life so that you go to this conference and you come back, and God spoke to you at that conference. And look what he's done in the ensuing years. And look at all the people, other grieving parents that you've been able to help and your friend was able to help, simply because you decided to work with God and let him work through you. And now look at all the lives that have been touched.
Mhm,
And what a great way to honor your son. I mean, what an incredible way. So he
mhm.
continues to touch people's lives through you, even though he hasn't been with us for a while. I
Yes.
love that. I love how God does that.
Mhm. Yes. I love that too.
Yeah. Let me ask you something. I think this is, I hear consistently from people how important this is. I know that it is, and I know what your answer is going to be, pretty sure. So when we begin that healing process, when our when we start beginning to be able to see life again and think about the lives of our children and the memories the good memories that we had and all that we enjoyed for those years that we had them, then we're able to be able to interact with people again. And Kathy and I found that community was so important in our healing process. What was that like for you guys?
Well, initially, about 3 months after David died, we went to a support group. I won't mention the name of it because it's nationwide. But, and it wasn't just child loss. There were aunts and uncles and grandmas and grandpas. It was about 25 people, and we sat in a circle. We couldn't talk about God, for one thing. Not that I wanted to, but there was one guy who was sharing about losing his daughter, and she had been gone for 15 years. And when we left that night, I said to my husband, I said, you know what? I said, if I'm going to look as bad as that guy looks in 15 years, you might as well just put me in the grave right now. And I realized it wasn't the right group. And the first time I really was so comforted was our daughter had moved out to Colorado, and we went out there, and she had started to get involved in suicide prevention. And we met a couple who had lost their son to suicide. And that was the first time that I had met someone who had not only lost a child, but had lost a child to suicide. And I just realized the importance of being with other people with similar losses.
Yeah.
I know you can't compare losses, but my daughter used to get upset with me because I would say, "But you don't know what it's like to lose a child." And she would get upset because she thought I was saying my loss was worse than hers, which I wasn't. But again, I haven't lost a brother yet.
Right. Right.
I can't relate to that either, but we need to be with other moms and dads who have lost children.
I agree.
Well, they have the roadmap. They've already been down the road. And you could say something to me like, "Ann, you shouldn't be doing that." And I don't mean you, Greg, but I mean like some church
Sure.
lady.
Sure.
And I would just be like, "Are you kidding me?" But if it was someone who had lost a child who said the very same thing to me, you know what? I have to listen to what they're saying. And we do get stuck in our grief. And I think
Oh, yeah.
it's important to have people around us that have been down the path longer than we have to be able to say, "You're stuck and maybe this is what you should do."
Those are really good words, Ann. And I'm glad that you guys were able to step into those relationships with others who had experienced the same thing. And I think it is different. It's like there's an instant connection when you meet somebody, another parent or parents who have experienced suicide loss or they've lost a child at the very least, no matter what the cause was. It's like there's this instant bond between you and they get you. You don't have to explain why you do certain things or why I can't go to the grocery store or why I can't go back to church right now. They get it. They've been there. They understand it. And so
Yeah.
you just feel so much more at ease with them knowing that somebody understands me.
Yeah. A friend of mine used to say, we speak the same language. But you have to find the right group. I went to another group, a suicide survivor group. By the time I left the group, I felt worse than when I got there. I had reached out to a nurse that worked in the hospital across the street from me. We got connected, and her and I started going to these suicide survivor groups. And I said, we both felt worse after the meeting. And so that's one of the things we tried to do in Hearts of Hope was to give moms tools to grieve, because I used to say to my friend who really took care of me for 3 months after David died, I would say, "Ruthie, I don't know how to do this. How do I do this? How do I grieve? I don't
Yeah.
know how to grieve." I mean, I'd lost my dad, and that was a sudden loss, and he was only 70, and I was his, he was my hero,
Yeah.
and that was hard, but this couldn't even compare to that.
I
And
understand.
that was the other thing, about being in groups. I was in one group where there was 3 ladies who had lost their mothers. And I don't mean recently, I'm talking like 3, 4 years. And I just found myself getting angry that, like I would think to myself, you don't know what it is. We're supposed to lose our parents. We know that, but we're never, you're not supposed to lose your child,
Right.
you know?
Right. Those are
And
expected losses.
yeah.
Nobody ever expects to lose a child. And we don't come equipped to know how to process it and walk through it. So, how was that friend able to help you?
I was in such shock. I don't think the shock wore off for a year. There's a lot I don't even remember about the first 3 months. Well, my friend took care of me, like eating and, changing my clothes. And But she didn't know how to help me either because
No.
she hadn't lost a child. Her and her husband both were there every day. And the other thing I didn't realize, because of the trauma of finding David, I was about 8 years down the road and I thought I was doing really well. But what I realized, what I never dealt with the trauma of finding him. And so I did end up doing some trauma therapy after that, which I don't know if it helped me or not, but there's times where I felt like I was stuck. I remember
Yeah.
going to one new therapist and she said, "So tell me your story, Anne." So I told her my story. And by the time I got done, she was just like amazed that I was even breathing and walking, you know.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, and when you describe feeling stuck, there is actually a medical diagnosis known as prolonged grief disorder. I mean, it was just
Mm,
recently in the last 2 or 3 years added to the mental health guidelines that psychiatrists and psychologists use, for diagnosing, and it's a
mhm,
very real thing. We feel like we're stuck, and that's what they call it in the medical profession, is prolonged grief disorder. So
mhm.
yeah, it's very real.
And I think sometimes grief is kind of like an onion. There's layers of grief.
Yeah.
And depending on your life and what's going on, in your marriage or with your other children, it brings up certain things. And it's like, God knows we can't deal with everything at once. So little by little, things come up and then we have to deal with them.
That's a great analogy.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
I think that really more accurately describes it than the stages of grief.
Hmm.
Because
Yeah.
there's so many layers to it, and I think that's an incredible analogy. Let me ask you one last question. What do you think when you look back over these, it's been a long time since 2000, I believe, is when you guys lost David.
Yes.
What do you feel like you're a different person today than you were prior to 2000? Sometimes we feel like in the fire, as it were, in those trials and sufferings of life, that God uses those things to refine us like nothing else can. How would you describe how that's played out in your life?
When I look at pictures of myself before David died, I don't even recognize myself. And I put it ADD and BDD, before David died and after David died.
Yeah.
And one of the best books we ever found that we put in our baskets is The Journey Through Grief by Dr. Alan Wolfelt. And he talks about the 6 needs of mourning. And one of those is developing a new self identity. And I'm David's mom. I will always be David's mom.
Right.
But my grief has given me gifts that I never knew that I had. Even the home that we moved to after David died, because he died in our home. And I said from day one, I said, I can't stay here. And my husband was so against moving because we had a low mortgage and, why should we move and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, every time I pulled into the garage, I saw David laying there and I couldn't live out the rest of my life. So we moved to a brand new house right across the street from some dear friends of ours who had lost their little girl when she was 5 years old. And what a gift that was. What I called it my healing house, because we were there about 12 years and we really did heal. I think, when you buried your child, you become a force to be reckoned with. And I don't I don't put up with a lot of the stuff that I used to put up with. Life is too short for that, and
Amen.
I'm not a superficial person, and I don't want to be in superficial relationships. I'm very particular about who I spend most of my time with, and I've just come to appreciate life, and I found joy again, which when I was daring God, like there's no way. And I
Yeah.
used to tell moms early on, I used to tell moms, I'll never be happy. Happiness is happenstance. And, after everything I've been through, I will never be happy. I feel bad that I said that now, but I think more what I feel is joy, because I do. David used to say, "Mom, stop and smell the roses." And I
Oh,
do now. I just I take the time to live in the present, because I was always a worrywart and a people pleaser. And a lot of that's changed, because I'm just going to be who I am. And one of the gifts that I discovered after David died was that I could write. As nurses, we didn't have to write. I mean, our notes were like 3-word sentences,
yeah, yeah.
and so I was never a writer. But one day the Lord spoke to my heart and said, I want you to enter this writing contest. And it was about
Wow.
3 years after David died. And I was like, what? What am I going to say? And I laid down to take a nap, and God just gave me the words, like, this is what I want you to say. And it was all about healthcare heroes. And why did you choose the profession that you chose? And so I just wrote this, and I ended up winning the contest.
Wow.
I was one of 10 healthcare heroes in Connecticut that year. And then that just
Amazing.
kind of grew to when I left California. I was flying to Arizona after being at the ministry conference. I was flying to California to see my brother, and I heard God say in my heart, "I want you to write this down. I want you to write your story down." And I didn't have any paper, so I wrote it on a napkin. And I called it From Nightmares to Miracles, because I
I
woke
love
up.
that.
I woke up the first day of school at 6:30 to a gun blast, and that was a nightmare. And I woke up every morning to a nightmare. And so nightmares aren't just for the night. And, the miracle is that God took me from there to where I am now. And it's taken a long time. My therapist said to me, I said, "How long is this going to be? How long am I going to feel like this?" And she said, "Give yourself 3 to 5 years." And that was really about the time, because that was around the time I went to California and everything changed. But those first 5 years, and especially going back to work and taking care of teenage boys, David, I saw David on a gurney and a body bag. And my patients were on gurneys every day because they were going into the OR.
Yeah.
And so it was something I didn't know I could do. And there were certain things I couldn't do. I would ask my
Sure.
coworkers, "Can you take them into the OR for the induction?" Because that was very hard for me to watch, these kids that were being induced, but, it was like watching them die, and I couldn't do that. So,
Yeah.
and actually people that, knew me early on, I don't even have a lot of those people in my life anymore.
Yeah. I understand that.
I don't know if you find, but I just
Yeah.
found, people
Yeah.
just, I don't know, I don't know if it's they can't handle our grief, or
Yeah.
it hurts them too much to see us hurting, that they walk out of our lives.
But it leaves us wondering. I mean, we rarely ever do we get the answers to those two questions. But yeah, we experience that. Grief has a way of thinning the herd, doesn't
Yes, yes. Well, and not only that, but God brings people into your life
it?
that
Yeah,
you would have expected. And
absolutely.
he knows what we need. So,
He
uh,
does. He does. His timeline is not like ours, and his ways are not like ours. But his ways are perfect. And the way that he arranges things in our lives and the way that he heals us when we didn't think there was a chance that we would ever get better. Look at both of us now and your husband and my wife. And when I think about all that God has done in healing y'all and in healing us, and then allowing you guys and us to be able to reach out and find ways to help other grieving parents. I mean, only God can do stuff like that. And I'm just so thankful that he doesn't waste anything, and he redeems it. No matter how bad it is or how painful, he redeems it for good if we will just let him. And I know you
mhm,
found that. Well, Anne, I just so appreciate your transparency and honesty about your grief journey and your subsequent healing journey and what God's done in your life. I just appreciate so much that you didn't try to sugarcoat anything, because people that are listening today that are grieving, they don't want anything sugar-coated. They just want the rawness and the honesty of what it's like, and to know that there's hope, and to know that they can experience, as you said, they can experience joy again. Happiness comes and goes, but joy transcends circumstances. So I
Mhm.
appreciate you sharing that and for giving us a glimpse into the life of a mom who lost her son many years ago. I know that people are going to find this very encouraging and hopeful.
Well, I want people to know that you can survive this kind of a loss and you can come out on the other side better instead of bitter. I like to use that, the bitter, better. There's a difference of the I and the E,
Yeah, I
and
love
the
that.
E better is Emmanuel, which is, God with us. Big part of my healing was reaching out to hurting moms. And we found in our support group that when a mom got to a point where she was able to reach out and either bring another mom with her or come with us to deliver a basket or just even make a phone call, it was a turning point in their healing when you can do that, when you can reach out and help someone else. I mean,
Absolutely.
early on, let's face it, who has the energy for that? And I'm not sure that's the best thing to do. We also found that moms that started, support groups or big organizations or whatever early on didn't always fare so well. You need to have time to grieve and to really wrestle with all the questions that you have and all the whys. And, I had to come to people used to say, well, why? Why do you? And I used to ask why. And then one day it occurred to me, even if I knew why, it wouldn't change anything. And
Precisely.
so I don't need to know why anymore. I'm at peace with that. David, he didn't do it to hurt us. He
Right.
was in a dark place. And the way that I really made peace with his suicide is that he was not in his right mind when he pulled that trigger.
Exactly.
Because people would ask me, well, aren't you mad at him? I'm like, no, I can't be mad at David because he would never do anything to hurt us.
Right.
But mad at God? Yeah, I was mad at God. But God can handle it.
He can. He handles it
And he
way
did.
better than we do. Well, and again, thank you so much for being my guest. I have so enjoyed our conversation today, as well as a couple of months or so ago when we initially talked by phone. And I know that God's going to continue to use your story and use you to help other people. So thank you for sharing with us
You're
today.
welcome. Well, thank you for what you and your wife are doing because it's important. We need people that get it.
Yeah, we do, and we both are very thankful that the Lord chose to use us in this way. It's a privilege. Well, thank you for joining us today. We hope you found this episode encouraging and helpful. If you did, would you mind taking just 1 minute to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts by clicking the link provided in each episode description and then sharing with someone you know? And as always, thank you for listening.